You know, there are parties, and then there are Hollywood parties. The first kind is for celebrating. The second, well, that's for performing. I've learned that in a town built on make-believe, the most convincing role you can play is yourself, or at least the version of yourself everyone expects to see. On that warm Californian evening, Veronica was playing the part of a lifetime, the gracious, contented wife of Arthur Vance. Their house, a glass jewel perched high in the hills, overlooked the glittering sea of lights that was Los Angeles. From up there, everything looked perfect, ordered, like a scene meticulously arranged by a master director. Life is funny that way. It often gives you the best view right before it pulls the rug from under your feet. Veronica, at 58, still possessed the kind of beauty that turned heads, a quiet, classic elegance that Hollywood had once adored, and then, as it always does, forgotten. She held a champagne flute, the bubbles long since gone flat, and smiled. It was a perfect smile, practiced over decades of camera flashes and hollow compliments. But her eyes, if you looked closely enough, were tired. They were watching the parade of hungry young faces, the ambitious starlets and hopeful writers, all orbiting her husband Arthur like planets around a sun. Arthur was in his element. He was a conductor of whispers and ambition, his laugh a little too loud, his hand on someone's back a little too familiar. He moved through the crowd with the easy confidence of a man who owned the world, or at least the small, glittering corner of it they all desperately wanted a piece of. Veronica saw Arthur talking to a young actress, her hair the color of spun gold, her eyes wide with the American dream. He called it networking. Everyone in town called it Arthur's process. A known secret, you see, is the most dangerous kind. It's a truth everyone agrees to pretend isn't there. A dull throb began behind Veronica's temples. It was a familiar ache, one that often arrived when the performance became too much to bear. She caught Arthur's eye across the room, and he gave her that reassuring smile of his, the one that said, "It's just business, darling. All of this is for us." For a moment, she almost believed him. She wanted to believe him. But as she turned away, her gaze fell upon a young woman clearing empty glasses. She was a caterer, a pretty blonde in her early 20s, almost invisible in her simple black uniform. But there was a spark in her, a raw, untamed energy that reminded Veronica of herself a lifetime ago. The girl glanced up, her eyes met Veronica's for a fleeting second, and then she looked toward Arthur. It was just a glance, but it held a flicker of something. Knowing. That's when the headache bloomed into a migraine. The jazz music, the laughter, the clinking glasses, it all became a suffocating noise. That's the way life is, I always say. Your own body often knows the truth long before your heart is ready to accept it. "I'm going up, darling," she whispered to Arthur as she passed him, placing a gentle hand on his arm. "My head is splitting." He barely turned, his focus still on the starlet. "Of course, my love. Rest. I'll be up in a little while." As Veronica walked away from the noise and the light, ascending the grand staircase that spiraled up into the quiet darkness of their home, she felt a profound sense of loneliness. She was leaving her own party, a ghost in her own gilded cage. She didn't know it then, of course, but she wasn't just walking away from the noise. She was walking toward a silence that would shatter her world.
Sleep, is a funny thing. Sometimes it's a refuge, a soft place to land after a hard day. But other times it refuses to come, standing guard at the door of your consciousness because it knows there's a truth you're not yet ready to face in the light of day. For Veronica, sleep was a shallow, restless sea that night. She drifted on its surface, the party's phantom laughter still ringing in her ears. She awoke with a start, the way you do when a bad dream has ended but its shadow still lingers. The clock on her nightstand glowed with the numbers 2:17 a.m. The silence in the house was absolute, a heavy blanket where the music and chatter had been. It was a rich person's silence, bought and paid for, designed to keep the world out. But tonight, it felt different. It felt empty. She reached a hand across the vast expanse of the California king bed. The sheets were cool to the touch. He wasn't there. Of course he wasn't. Arthur often worked late in his study, falling asleep over scripts and contracts. It was part of the myth of the man. The tireless producer. It was the story she told herself. But the story felt thin tonight, worn out from too many tellings. A new kind of ache, sharper than the migraine, settled in her chest. She slipped out of bed, her bare feet silent on the cold marble floor. Wrapping herself in a silk robe, she felt like a visitor in her own home. The moonlight poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows, painting long, distorted shadows across the expensive furniture. The house had never felt so large or so cold. She descended the spiral staircase, each step a deliberate, quiet movement. She checked his study first. Empty. The leather chair was pushed in, the computer screen dark. As she stood in the cavernous living room where the party had roared just hours before, she heard it. At first, it was just a low, indistinct murmur, a vibration she felt more than she heard. It was coming from the lower level, from their cinema room. Her heart gave a sudden hard thud against her ribs. She moved towards the sound, drawn by a terrible curiosity. I've learned that the most frightening journeys we take are not across miles, but on the quiet rooms of our own homes, on our way to a truth we suspect is waiting. As she got closer, the sound became clearer. It was dialogue from a movie. And then a wave of cold washed over her. She knew that voice. Oh, she knew that voice. It was husky, a little breathless, full of a hope and fire she hadn't had in 30 years. It was her own voice. She stood before the heavy, soundproof door, which was slightly ajar. A sliver of flickering light escaped from within. The voice on the screen was Veronica's, at 25, playing the part of a woman desperately in love in a film called Sunset Lovers. And underneath her own voice, she could hear another whisper. A man's voice. It was Arthur, and he wasn't alone.
You know, they say the truth will set you free, but they never tell you what it does to you first. Sometimes the truth is not a gentle dawn. It is a violent, blinding flash of lightning that splits your world in two, leaving you standing in the smoking ruins of everything you thought you knew. Veronica's hand was frozen on the heavy wooden door. Her knuckles were white. Her breath was trapped somewhere in her throat. She had pushed the door just enough to see, and now she couldn't look away. It was a scene from a nightmare, but worse because it was real. There, on the vast screen that had hosted premieres and private viewings for Hollywood's elite, was her own face, luminous and young. She was in the arms of her long-gone co-star, whispering words of eternal love. The scene was the film's climax, a moment of raw, passionate surrender that had defined her career. And in the plush velvet armchair directly in front of the screen, bathed in the flickering light of her own ghost, was Arthur. He was kissing the girl from the party, the pretty blonde caterer. Her black uniform was unbuttoned at the collar. He held the girl's face in his hands, his eyes closed. And as the young Veronica on screen spoke her lines, Arthur whispered them back to the girl in his arms. "I'll never leave you," the screen Veronica promised. "I'll never leave you," Arthur echoed, his lips moving against the waitress's. That was the moment the lightning struck. It wasn't just the infidelity. Oh, that was a familiar, dull ache she had learned to live with, the known secret of their marriage. This was something far more monstrous. He wasn't just cheating on her, he was erasing her. He was taking the one thing that was truly hers, her youth, her art, her very identity, and using it as a script to seduce a new, younger version. The girl wasn't just a conquest, she was a stand-in, a prop. Veronica was both the audience and the unwilling star of the most cruel performance of her life. Her mind went completely, utterly quiet. The shock was a strange, merciful anesthetic. She felt a profound detachment, as if she were floating above her own body, watching a movie about some other poor woman. She saw her own hand, as in slow motion, gently pull back from the door. She let it close without a sound. The latch didn't click. The scene inside continued, undisturbed. She turned and walked away, one foot in front of the other. Back up the spiral staircase, through the moonlit shadows of her cold, perfect house. She didn't cry. The pain was too deep for tears. Tears are for sadness. This was a demolition. Back in her bedroom, she stood in front of the full-length mirror. The woman looking back at her was a stranger. The face was hers, but the life behind the eyes had just been extinguished. The years of compromise, of looking the other way, of believing the "it's just business" lie, they all collapsed in on themselves. The gilded cage had vanished, and she was simply standing in the rubble. That's a lesson life teaches you the hard way. Betrayal is rarely just about the act itself. It's about the meaning behind it. And Arthur's meaning was clear. He didn't just want a new woman. He wanted his old one back, but in a newer body. He didn't love her, he loved a memory. And that night, he had proven he was more than willing to replace the original with a cheap copy.
There are two kinds of silence after a storm. There's the peaceful quiet, when the rain has washed the world clean and you can finally take a deep breath. And then there's the other kind, the heavy, electric silence when the storm has passed over your house, but you know it's still raging just out of sight. That was the silence in Veronica's bedroom. She didn't move from her spot by the window. She just sat there, watching the distant, indifferent lights of the city. She heard the soft click of the bedroom door. She smelled his cologne, the familiar, expensive scent he wore like armor. She felt his presence enter the room, a disturbance in the air. He was trying to be quiet, moving with a practiced stealth she now recognized as the choreography of a man with something to hide. "You're still awake?" Arthur's voice was a low murmur, carefully calibrated to sound concerned, loving even. He was still performing. Veronica didn't turn. She kept her eyes on the window. "I couldn't sleep." Her own voice sounded strange to her, flat and calm. All the emotion had been scoured out of it. He walked over to the dresser, emptying his pockets with a soft jingle of keys and coins. "These things always run later than they should," he sighed, the sound of a hard-working man at the end of a grueling day. A perfect performance. Just had to finalize a few details with the studio heads. "I've learned that the most convincing lies are the ones that are told with absolute, unwavering casualness. They are worn like a comfortable old sweater, not a stiff new suit. Arthur had been wearing this sweater for a very long time." Veronica finally turned her head, her gaze meeting his in the dim light. "I thought I heard a movie playing downstairs." For the first time, the actor faltered. It was just a flicker in his eyes, a momentary tightening in his jaw, but she saw it. He recovered quickly. A professional. Ah, that. Yes, just had a thought about a remake. Pulled up some old footage to see if it still holds up. He gave a small, dismissive shrug. You know how my mind works. She looked at him. Really looked at him, perhaps for the first time in years. The handsome, powerful man she had married was gone. In his place stood a tired magician whose tricks she had finally figured out. He wasn't a monster. He was worse. He was a hollow man, desperately trying to fill himself up with the youth and adoration of others. "Which film was it?" she asked, her voice still unnervingly calm. He hesitated again, and in that hesitation she had her final, brutal confirmation. He couldn't even remember the name of the movie he had just used to defile their life together. "Oh, you know, that little indie thing from, what was it, 92, 93? It was Sunset Lovers," Veronica said softly, and in her voice there was no anger, no sadness. There was only a final, chilling finality. And it was 1994. She stood up then, pulling her silk robe tighter around herself, and walked past him toward the bathroom. He said her name, a question in his voice, but she didn't stop. That's how life is sometimes. The most important conversations have almost no words at all. It wasn't a fight. It was an autopsy. And Veronica had just confirmed the cause of death. As she closed the bathroom door behind her, locking it with a quiet click, she knew one thing with absolute certainty. The performance was over, the credits had rolled on her marriage, and for the first time in a very long time, Veronica was thinking about what she was going to do in the morning.
You know, we spend the better part of our lives collecting things, trophies, furniture, jewelry, memories. We think they define us, that they tell the story of who we are. But I've learned that our true character is revealed not by what we accumulate, but by what we are willing to walk away from. In the pre-dawn stillness of her cavernous walk-in closet, Veronica stood before a life's worth of acquisitions. There were gowns that had graced red carpets, their sequins like the scales of a beautiful, exotic fish. There were rows of designer shoes, each pair a memory of a premiere or a gala. They were costumes for a role she was finished playing. She didn't touch a single one. Instead, she pulled an old, forgotten suitcase from the very back. It was a simple, sturdy thing she'd had before Arthur, before Hollywood. Dusting it off felt like greeting an old friend. And into it, she packed the woman she had been and the woman she hoped she might become again. She didn't pack the diamonds Arthur had given her. Those weren't gifts, she now realized. They were golden shackles. She packed her mother's simple silver locket. She didn't pack the silk robes. She packed a pair of sturdy blue jeans she hadn't worn in a decade and a soft, worn-out cashmere sweater. She took a faded photograph of her parents standing proud in front of their small Ohio home, their faces full of the kind of ordinary, unshakable love she had always craved. She took a dog-eared copy of The Grapes of Wrath, a book that had taught her about resilience when she was just a girl with a dream. And the strangest thing happened. As she filled the small suitcase, her life began to feel larger. The more she left behind, the couture, the jewels, the empty promises they represented, the lighter she felt. The weight wasn't in the things she was taking, it was in the things she was finally setting down. With the suitcase packed, she walked back into the bedroom. Arthur was a still form under the expensive sheets, his breathing deep and even. The great producer, the master of ceremonies, was just a sleeping man, oblivious. For a moment, she looked at him, not with hatred, but with a strange, detached pity. He would wake up in a few hours and begin his performance again, never knowing the theater was now empty. Her eyes fell on her own left hand. On it, the wedding ring, a diamond so large it felt like a tiny, beautiful cage for her finger. With a calm, deliberate motion, she slipped it off. It felt surprisingly heavy in her palm. She walked over to Arthur's side of the bed and placed it on the nightstand, right next to his wallet and his keys. It wasn't a gesture of anger. It was a resignation. A quiet, dignified closing statement. That's the way life is. Sometimes the loudest declaration you can make is the one you make in total silence. She picked up the suitcase, which felt as light as a bird's wing, and walked out of the room. She didn't look back. The quiet click of the front door closing behind her was the most liberating sound she had ever heard.
I've always believed the bravest thing a person can do is turn the key in the ignition. Not just in a car, you understand, but in their own life. It's the moment you decide to stop being a passenger and start driving. You may not know the destination, and the road ahead might be dark, but you're trusting that your headlights will show you enough of the way to keep going. Veronica didn't go to the fleet of new, sensible cars Arthur had bought for her. She walked to the far corner of the 5-car garage, to the one that was truly hers. It was a 1996 Mercedes convertible, a beautiful, old boat of a car she'd bought for herself with the last big paycheck from her acting career. Arthur had always called it impractical. To her, it had always felt like freedom. The engine turned over on the first try, a deep, reassuring rumble in the concrete silence. She didn't look in the rearview mirror as she backed out. There was no point. There was nothing back there she wanted to see again. The sleeping mansions of the Hollywood Hills watched her go, their windows like closed, judgmental eyes. She wound her way down the serpentine road, leaving the rarefied air and the perfect manicured lawns behind. When she reached the bottom, she merged onto the 101 freeway. It was just before 5 in the morning, and the great, sleeping beast of Los Angeles was just beginning to stir. The freeway was a river of light, red taillights flowing one way, white headlights flowing the other. She was just another anonymous car in the current, and the feeling was intoxicating. For years, she had been Veronica Vance, the producer's wife. A name, a title, a role. Now, she was just a woman in a car, a ghost moving through the city as it woke. She drove east. It was an instinct, not a plan. She had driven west as a young woman, chasing the sun and a dream. Now, she was driving away from it, toward the dawn. And as she drove, the sky began to change. The flat, inky blackness softened to a deep violet, then bruised purple. And then it happened. The first defiant streak of orange cracked across the horizon behind the distant mountains. The light grew, spilling across the landscape, turning the gray asphalt to a ribbon of gold. It poured into her car, washing over her, and in that moment, she felt something she hadn't felt in 30 years. It wasn't happiness, not yet. It wasn't relief. It was possibility. That's the way life is. A sunrise doesn't promise you a perfect day, but it does promise you a new one, a clean slate, a chance to write a different story. Veronica reached up and pressed the button to lower the convertible top. The cool morning air rushed in, whipping through her hair, and it felt like the first clean breath she had taken in a lifetime. She didn't have a map. She had less than $1,000 in her purse and a single suitcase. She had no idea where she was going. But for the first time in a very long time, she was the one doing the driving.
You know, the new highways, the big interstates, they're built for efficiency. They're designed to get you from point A to point B, to help you bypass the life in between. But the old roads, the forgotten ones, they were built for a different purpose. They were built for the journey itself. By midday, Veronica was deep in the Mojave Desert. The sun was a relentless white-hot disk in a vast, pale blue sky. She had been on Interstate 40 for hours, a straight, predictable black ribbon cutting through the epic, empty landscape. It was fast. It was logical. It was everything her old life had been, and it was starting to feel just as suffocating. Her car radio couldn't find a signal, so the only sound was the wind and the drone of the engine. Her thoughts, for the first time, were quiet. The anger and the shock had burned away with the morning fog, leaving behind a profound emptiness. She wasn't sad. She was just erased, a blank canvas waiting for a new picture. Then she saw it. A sun-bleached brown sign, riddled with what looked like buckshot holes. It read, "Historic Route 66. The exit ramp was a cracked, weed-choked afterthought. The interstate roared onward, straight and true, toward the horizon. But this other road, it veered off into the shimmering heat, looking less like a highway and more like a memory. I've learned that the biggest decisions in our lives rarely come with flashing lights and trumpets. Often, it's just a quiet moment at a crossroads, a choice between the path of least resistance and the path of most meaning. Without thinking, Veronica flicked on her turn signal. She eased the old Mercedes down the ramp, the tires crunching on the loose gravel. The moment she was on it, the world changed. The pace slowed. The road was narrower, hugging the contours of the land instead of blasting through it. She passed the ghosts of the American dream, an abandoned gas station, its pumps rusted into silent skeletal figures, a motel with a cracked, empty swimming pool, and a sign that buzzed "Vxi" to no one. Faded billboards promised the world's best milkshake or a chance to see a real Gila monster. This wasn't just a road, it was a museum of forgotten hopes. She thought of the book in her suitcase, The Grapes of Wrath. The Joad family had traveled this same route west, running toward a dream. And here she was, driving east, running away from a dream that had turned sour. That's how life is. Sometimes you have to retrace the steps of the past to find your own future. She wasn't just driving on a road, she was driving through a story. The whispers of a million journeys, of families and dreamers and lonely travelers seemed to rise from the hot asphalt. And for the first time that day, she didn't feel empty. She felt like she was part of something vast and timeless. She wasn't on the fastest route anymore, but for the first time in a very long time, she felt like she was finally on the right one.
You know, there are two kinds of hunger. There's the kind that gnaws at your belly, the simple need for food. But there's a deeper kind, a hunger of the soul, for a little bit of human warmth, for a sign that you're not entirely alone in this world. And I've learned that sometimes the second one is far more desperate. The diner appeared out of the heat haze like a mirage. It was a long, low building with a sign that just said, "Eat," in sun-faded red letters. It wasn't a choice, it was a necessity. The Mercedes gaslight had been on for 20 miles, and Veronica felt as if she'd been running on empty for a lifetime. Her beautiful car, covered in a fine layer of desert dust, looked as out of place as a tuxedo at a backyard barbecue. The bell above the door announced her arrival with a cheerful, rusty jingle. The air inside was thick with the smell of old coffee, bacon, and that particular scent of a place that has seen 1,000 stories come and go. It was a world away from the hushed, jasmine-scented restaurants of her former life. A handful of truckers sat at the counter, and a family shared a pancake breakfast in a cracked red vinyl booth. A woman behind the counter looked up. She was probably about Veronica's age, with a kind, weary face and hair pulled back in a simple, no-nonsense ponytail. Her name tag, pinned to a pale pink uniform, read Marge. "Find a seat anywhere, hun," Marge said, her voice warm and gravelly, like the road Veronica had just driven. Veronica slid into a booth by the window. The vinyl was cool against her skin. She felt conspicuous, exposed. She half expected someone to recognize her, but no one gave her a second glance. Here, she wasn't a former actress or a producer's wife. She was just another traveler with tired eyes. Marge appeared with a glass of water and a menu sticky from years of use. "What can I get for you?" Veronica looked down at the menu, but the words swam before her eyes. "Just coffee, please. Black." "You got it," Marge said, and moved away with an economy of motion that spoke of decades spent on her feet. She returned a moment later with a thick, heavy ceramic mug and a glass coffee pot, its contents as dark and murky as the bottom of a well. She filled the mug, and the steam that rose from it was the first comforting thing Veronica had felt all day. She wrapped her hands around the mug, letting the warmth seep into her bones. Marge stood there for a second, just looking at her. Not in a prying way, but with a simple, quiet observation. "Long way from home?" Marge asked, gently. Veronica just nodded, unable to find her voice. Marge gave a small, understanding smile. A few minutes later, she returned, not just with the coffee pot, but with a plate holding a thick slice of apple pie. She set it down in front of Veronica. "I didn't order this," Veronica said, her voice a little shaky. "I know," Marge replied, already turning away. "On the house. You look like you could use it." That's how life is. Sometimes salvation isn't a grand, dramatic rescue. Sometimes it's a cup of hot coffee and a slice of pie you didn't ask for, served by a stranger who sees the hunger in your soul and asks for nothing in return. For the first time since she'd walked out of her gilded cage, Veronica felt a crack in the icy numbness that had encased her heart, and through that crack, a single warm tear escaped and traced a clean path through the dust on her cheek.
It's a funny thing about the past. You can drive 1,000 miles, cross deserts and mountains, and think you've left it all behind in a cloud of dust. But the past has a way of catching up. It doesn't use the interstate. It takes the scenic route right through your own heart, and it tends to pop up when you least expect it, like a ghost on the side of the road. After the diner, Veronica felt a fragile sense of peace. Marge's simple kindness had been a balm. The coffee and pie had quieted the hunger in her soul, at least for a little while. She was driving again, not with the frantic urgency of the morning, but with a slow, aimless curiosity. The old Mercedes purred along the forgotten highway, the late afternoon sun casting long, dramatic shadows across the landscape. She was just outside a small, dusty town in Arizona, the kind of place with one main street and more churches than gas stations. And then she saw it. It was a billboard, but not for a casino or a soft drink. This one was old, its colors faded by decades of relentless sun. It stood at a crooked angle in a field of dry weeds, a relic from another time. It was an advertisement for a local film festival, a classic Hollywood revival, and the face smiling down from it, a face 30 years younger, impossibly beautiful and full of fire she had forgotten she ever had, was her own. The image was from Sunset Lovers, the same film, the same ghost that had haunted her cinema room just the night before. But here, under the vast open sky of the American West, it felt different. It wasn't a weapon used against her. It was just a memory.
a picture of a girl she used to know. She pulled the car over onto the gravel shoulder, the dust settling around her in a soft cloud. She just sat there, engine idling, and stared up at her own smiling face. That girl on the billboard had believed in so many things. She'd believed in love, in happily ever after, in the enduring power of the American dream. She'd believed that if you were beautiful and talented and worked hard enough, the world would be yours. "Oh, honey," Veronica whispered to the girl on the billboard, "you had no idea." A wave of profound sadness washed over her, not for the life she had just left, but for the girl she had been. The girl whose dreams had been packaged, sold, and eventually traded in for a newer model. She thought of Arthur, whispering those lines, and the anger returned. But it was a different kind of anger now. It was colder, clearer. It wasn't just about his betrayal of her as a wife. It was about his betrayal of that girl, the one with all the hope in her eyes. He hadn't just broken a marriage, he had corrupted a memory. That's how life is. You can't escape who you were, but what I've learned is that you don't have to. The key is to stop running from that ghost on the billboard and instead pull over to the side of the road and have a good, long talk with her. You have to acknowledge her, honor her dreams, and then, gently, tell her that you'll be the one to write the rest of the story. Sitting there, in the shadow of her own past, Veronica made a silent promise to that girl. She didn't know how, and she didn't know when, but she would reclaim that story. She wouldn't let the final scene be the one she had witnessed in the dark. She would write a new ending.
You know, the loneliest place in the world isn't a deserted highway in the middle of nowhere. It's a cheap motel room with 4 walls that have heard a million secrets but will never tell a single one. It's in those anonymous spaces, under the unforgiving glow of a single dim lamp, that you can no longer run from the one person you've been avoiding the most, yourself. The motel was called the Stardust Inn, but there was no stardust left in it. The neon sign outside flickered, casting a sickly pink glow into Veronica's room. The air smelled of disinfectant and something vaguely regretful. Everything about the room, the scratchy brown bedspread, the bolted-down television, the single bar of soap wrapped in paper, was a universe away from the life she had left behind less than 24 hours ago. She dropped her suitcase on the floor and sank onto the edge of the bed. The exhaustion was a physical weight now, pressing down on her shoulders, making her bones ache. The adrenaline was gone, the shock was gone, the quiet anger was gone. All that was left was a vast, hollow emptiness. She caught her reflection in the dark, fly-specked mirror above the dresser. She saw a woman of 58, her expensive hairstyle now a mess from the desert wind, her makeup long since faded, her eyes red-rimmed and empty. There was no trace of the Hollywood wife, no echo of the silver screen starlet. There was just this woman, a stranger she had been living with for decades without ever truly meeting. And in the profound, buzzing silence of that room, she began to speak. The words were for no one but herself, a confession to the 4 walls and the woman in the mirror. She whispered, the sound rough and unused in her throat. "I knew. I always knew." She said it again, a little louder this time, testing the weight of the truth on her tongue. "He didn't hide it. Not really. I just chose not to see it." A dry, humorless sob escaped her. "No, that's not true. I saw. I saw it all. I saw the lingering touches, the late-night calls, the lipstick on a collar that was just a smudge of ink. I saw." Tears began to stream down her face now, hot and silent. This wasn't the single poignant tear from the diner. This was a flood, a release of 30 years of unspoken truths. "I made a deal," she confessed to her own reflection. "I traded my voice for this beautiful cage. I let him turn my name into an accessory for his. I let him chip away at me,
piece by piece, until all that was left was the pretty, smiling wife who hosted his parties. I let him do it. For the house, for the security, for the ease of it all. The final admission was the hardest, a jagged piece of glass she had to pull from her own soul. She choked out, "He didn't just steal my youth last night. I helped. I let it become something he could own, something he could give to someone else. That's how life is. The truth you whisper to yourself in a dark room with no audience and no applause is the only one that can truly set you free. It's a painful, brutal kind of freedom, but it's the only kind that lasts." She cried until there were no tears left, her body shaking with the force of it all. She wept for the girl on the billboard and for the woman in the mirror. She wept for the years she had lost to a comfortable lie. And when it was over, she felt clean, scoured out. Empty, yes, but it was a different kind of emptiness now. It wasn't a void, it was a clearing, a space to build something new. That night, in the cheap bed at the Stardust Inn, under a scratchy brown blanket, Veronica slept for the first time without dreams. It was the deep, dreamless, and utterly profound sleep of a woman who had, finally, after a lifetime of performance, told the truth.
The morning after a soul storm is a strange and quiet thing. You wake up and the world looks exactly the same, but you are fundamentally different. You don't rebuild a life all at once with a grand blueprint and a construction crew. No, I've learned you start with one brick, one clean dish, one made bed. You start by finding a small, tangible piece of the world and putting it right. Veronica woke up in that dusty motel room feeling quiet. The raw, howling grief of the night before had passed, leaving behind a clean, fragile stillness. She sat on the edge of the bed and sipped the terrible, watery coffee she'd made in the room's little machine. It was bitter, but it was hot, and it was hers. She decided to take a walk. The town, whose name she didn't even know, was slowly coming to life. A pickup truck rumbled past, the driver giving her a polite nod. The air smelled of dry earth and bacon from the diner down the street. It was all so ordinary, so real. In Hollywood, every morning had been a rehearsal for the day's performance. Here, it was just morning. In the center of the small town square, next to the post office, was a covered community notice board. It was a chaotic mess. Faded flyers for a high school baseball game from last season were tacked over notices for a church bake sale. A picture of a lost cat, its edges curled and water-stained, was half hidden by a political poster from an election that was long over. It was a collage of a community's life, but it was neglected and impossible to read. Something stirred in Veronica. It wasn't a grand idea. It was a tiny, simple impulse. An itch. This was something that was wrong, and she knew how to make it right. She walked into the town's general store, the kind of place that sold everything from hammers to greeting cards. The bell on the door jingled. She bought a box of flat-headed thumbtacks and a small roll of tape. The man behind the counter barely looked up. To him, she was nobody, and the anonymity was a strange and wonderful comfort. Back at the board, she started to work. Her hands, which had once been manicured to perfection, began to gently pull out the old, rusted tacks. She carefully took down the rain-soaked, irrelevant notices, folding them and placing them in a nearby trash can. She smoothed out the current flyers, the yoga class in the church basement, the ad for a local handyman, the notice about the town meeting. She retacked them, giving each one its own space, its own breath. She organized the chaos. She wasn't thinking about Arthur. She wasn't thinking about the girl, or the party, or the 30 years of a life that had turned out to be a lie.
She was thinking only about the texture of the corkboard, the satisfying press of a thumbtack, the simple geometry of making lines straight. It took her nearly an hour. When she was done, the board was clean, orderly. Anyone could walk by and see at a glance the small, important deets of this town's heart. It wasn't a big thing. No one would ever thank her. No one had even seen her do it. But as she stood back and looked at her small piece of work, she felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt in a lifetime. It wasn't happiness. It was satisfaction. That's the way life is. Purpose isn't always a lightning bolt from the heavens. Sometimes it's found in a box of thumbtacks. It's the quiet, profound realization that you still have the power to make one small corner of the world a little bit better than you found it. And for a woman whose entire world had just been shattered, that small, quiet power felt like everything.
You know, they sell us a picture of Thanksgiving, don't they? A big golden brown turkey on a table surrounded by smiling, happy relatives. It's a beautiful picture. But for a lot of folks, it's a picture in a frame they can only look at from the outside. I've learned that the true spirit of that holiday often isn't found in the big, perfect gatherings. It's found in the small, imperfect moments of grace that happen when no one is looking. Veronica hadn't realized what day it was until she saw the sign on the general store's door, closed for Thanksgiving. Suddenly, the quiet streets felt profoundly empty. The whole country, it seemed, was indoors, gathered around tables, sharing stories and food and warmth. And she was a ghost, haunting a town where she didn't belong. The loneliness was a physical ache, colder and sharper than the autumn wind. There was only one place she could think to go, one place that might be a refuge from the crushing silence. Marge's diner. She didn't know if it would be open, but the hope of it was a small light in the gray afternoon. The eat sign was lit, a beacon. When she pushed the door open, the bell jingling its welcome, she was hit with a wall of warmth and the unmistakable smell of roasting turkey. The diner was mostly empty, save for two of the truckers she'd seen before, watching a football game on a small television perched in the corner. Marge looked up from behind the counter, a dish towel in her hand. She didn't look surprised to see her. She just smiled, a real, crinkle-eyed smile. "Figured we might see you today, hun. Grab a seat. Coffee's fresh." Veronica slid into the same booth, her hands wrapped around the warm mug Marge brought her. "I didn't think you'd be open," she said quietly. "Some people don't have anywhere else to go," Marge said simply, nodding toward the truckers. "And some of us have to work. Seemed better to do it together." She paused, then looked Veronica right in the eye. "We're having our staff dinner in a bit. Just me, the cook, and a couple of our regulars. It's not fancy, but there's more than enough. You'd be welcome to join." Veronica's throat tightened. In her old life, Thanksgiving had been a catered affair for 50 people, a performance of gratitude. This offer, from a woman who knew nothing about her except that she looked like she could use a slice of pie, felt more genuine than any of those lavish feasts. "I wouldn't want to intrude," she managed to say. "Nonsense," Marge said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "No one should eat alone on Thanksgiving." An hour later, Veronica was sitting in a large booth in the back of the diner with Marge, the two truckers who introduced themselves as Hank and Sal, and the quiet, sweating cook named Louis. The table was laden with plates of sliced turkey, a mountain of mashed potatoes, green bean casserole, and a can-shaped log of cranberry sauce. It was the Thanksgiving of 1,000 truck stops in small towns across America. It was perfect. No one asked her where she came from or where she was going. They talked about the football game. They argued about whether the pumpkin pie was better than the apple. They just were. They were a small, temporary family of strangers, brought together by a holiday and a highway. That's how life is. Family, she was learning, wasn't just something you were born into. Sometimes it was just a handful of strangers who saved you a seat at their table, no questions asked. As she took her first bite of turkey, sitting in that warm, brightly lit diner, surrounded by the quiet kindness of people she would likely never see again, she felt something she hadn't expected to feel. She felt thankful.
You know, the world loves to tell you that you only get one big shot, one moment in the spotlight. It sells you the idea that the curtain comes down and the show is over. But I've learned that's not how life works. Life isn't a one-act play. It's a rambling, beautiful, messy production. And if you're brave enough, you can always start a second act. The weeks after Thanksgiving drifted by in a quiet routine. Veronica was no longer just passing through the small town of Harmony, Arizona. She was staying. She'd found a slightly more permanent room to rent by the week. Her small reserve of cash was dwindling, a quiet ticking clock in the back of her mind. Most of her days were spent in the town library, losing herself in books, or taking long walks into the desert, watching the sunsets paint the sky in colors she'd never noticed from her glass house in the hills. One afternoon, she found herself standing in front of the community notice board again, her notice board, and there, tacked neatly in the center, was a flyer. Harmony Community Players present Thornton Wilder's Our Town. Auditions this week. Her heart gave a painful little lurch. Our Town, a play about the quiet, extraordinary beauty of ordinary life. It was a universe away from the melodramas of her past. The thought of acting again, of stepping onto any kind of stage, was terrifying. It was a door she had slammed shut 30 years ago. But the pull, it was like a phantom limb, an ache for something she thought was long gone. She didn't go to the auditions, but a few days later, she found herself drawn to the high school auditorium where they were rehearsing. The doors were propped open, and she slipped inside, taking a seat in the shadows of the very back row. The stage was bare, save for a few tables and chairs. A handful of townspeople, the local librarian, a retired mechanic, a young high school teacher were stumbling through the first act. It was clumsy, it was amateur, and it was the most beautiful thing she had seen in years. There was no vanity here, no agents, no box office numbers. There was only a group of people trying to tell a story together for the simple, pure love of it. The man directing them, a passionate, balding English teacher named Mr. Abernathy, was trying to coax a performance out of the woman playing Mrs. Gibbs. She was struggling with a simple, poignant line about wanting to see Paris. The woman said the line, but it was flat, just words. "No, no, Helen," Mr. Abernathy said kindly. "Remember, this is her one big dream, the one thing she holds on to that's just for her. It's a lifetime of longing in one sentence." From the darkness of the back row, Veronica felt the words rise in her own throat. She knew that longing. She understood the quiet.
You know, the world loves to tell you that you only get one big shot, one moment in the spotlight. It sells you the idea that the curtain comes down and the show is over. But I've learned that's not how life works. Life isn't a one-act play. It's a rambling, beautiful, messy production, and if you're brave enough, you can always start a second act. The weeks after Thanksgiving drifted by in a quiet routine. Veronica was no longer just passing through the small town of Harmony, Arizona. She was staying. She'd found a slightly more permanent room to rent by the week. Her small reserve of cash was dwindling, a quiet ticking clock in the back of her mind. Most of her days were spent in the town library, losing herself in books, or taking long walks into the desert, watching the sunsets paint the sky in colors she'd never noticed from her glass house in the hills. One afternoon, she found herself standing in front of the community notice board again, her notice board, and there, tacked neatly in the center, was a flyer. Harmony Community Players present Thornton Wilder's Our Town. Auditions this week. Her heart gave a painful little lurch. Our Town.
a play about the quiet, extraordinary beauty of ordinary life. It was a universe away from the melodramas of her past. The thought of acting again, of stepping onto any kind of stage, was terrifying. It was a door she had slammed shut 30 years ago. But the pull, it was like a phantom limb, an ache for something she thought was long gone. She didn't go to the auditions, but a few days later she found herself drawn to the high school auditorium where they were rehearsing. The doors were propped open, and she slipped inside, taking a seat in the shadows of the very back row. The stage was bare, save for a few tables and chairs. A handful of townspeople, the local librarian, a retired mechanic, a young high school teacher, were stumbling through the first act. It was clumsy, it was amateur, and it was the most beautiful thing she had seen in years. There was no vanity here, no agents, no box office numbers. There was only a group of people trying to tell a story together for the simple, pure love of it. The man directing them, a passionate, balding English teacher named Mr. Abernathy, was trying to coax a performance out of the woman playing Mrs. Gibbs. She was struggling with a simple, poignant line about wanting to see Paris. The woman said the line, but it was flat, just words. "No, no, Helen," Mr. Abernathy said kindly. "Remember, this is her one big dream, the one thing she holds on to that's just for her. It's a lifetime of longing in one sentence." From the darkness of the back row, Veronica felt the words rise in her own throat. She knew that longing. She understood the quiet desperation of a dream deferred. Without thinking, she whispered the line to herself, imbuing it with all the heartbreak and hope it contained. "It seems to me, once in your life, you ought to see a country where they don't talk in English and don't even want to." The words were barely a breath, but in the cavernous, quiet auditorium, they carried. Mr. Abernathy stopped and peered into the darkness. "Who's there?" Veronica froze, her heart hammering. She felt like a child caught doing something she shouldn't. Mr. Abernathy walked up the aisle, his eyes adjusting to the dim light. He saw a woman with tired, intelligent eyes and a face that held 1,000 stories. He said, "You heard me," he said, not with anger, but with a quiet curiosity. "Say it again." She hesitated, then looked at the stage and said the line again, a little louder this time. A hush fell over the small cast on stage. In her voice, they heard not just a line from a play, but the genuine, aching truth of a life. Mr. Abernathy stared at her for a long moment. He said, "You've done this before." It wasn't a question. "A long time ago," Veronica answered, her voice barely a whisper. "Our Helen had to drop out," he said, a hopeful, crazy idea dawning on his face. "The part of Mrs. Gibbs, it's open." That's how life is. Your second act doesn't always begin with a spotlight and applause. Sometimes it begins in the dusty back row of a high school auditorium with a whispered line that reminds you of who you really are.
You know, for a long time, the world has been getting smaller. We have phones that can reach across oceans in an instant, and yet it's still remarkably easy to disappear if you really want to. But what I've learned is that you can't outrun the echoes of the life you left behind. Sooner or later, a voice will find its way through the static, and you have to decide whether you're going to listen. Joining the Harmony Community Players was like learning to breathe again. In the dusty high school auditorium, Veronica wasn't the producer's wife or a faded movie star. She was just V, the woman with the incredible voice who was playing Mrs. Gibbs. She found a quiet joy in the work, in the collaboration, in helping the young teacher playing Emily find the truth in her lines. For the first time in decades, she felt like a part of something real, something she was building instead of just inhabiting. But the real world, with its practical demands, still existed.
Her money was almost gone. The old Mercedes needed a new fuel pump. The small kindnesses of the town couldn't pay her rent forever. With a heavy heart, she knew she had to make a call. There was a joint bank account, one she hadn't touched, a safety net she and Arthur had established years ago for emergencies. If this wasn't an emergency, she didn't know what was. She didn't use her cell phone. She let the battery die weeks ago. It felt like a tether to a world she didn't want. Instead, she went to the lone payphone outside the town's post office, the receiver cold against her ear. Her hands trembled slightly as she dialed the number for her bank in Beverly Hills, a number she knew by heart. After navigating a maze of automated prompts, a cheerful, professional voice answered. Veronica explained what she needed, a simple transfer of funds to a new, local account in Harmony, Arizona. "Of course, Mrs. Vance," the banker said. "Just one moment while I pull up the account. Standard procedure, I'll just need verbal authorization from the primary account holder as well. Is Mr. Vance available?" Veronica's blood ran cold. Of course, it was his account, really. She was just on it. "No," she said, her voice tight. "He's not." "I see," the banker said, a hint of suspicion in his voice. "Well, I'm afraid I can't authorize a transfer of that size without his consent. There's a flag on the account, you see, placed about a month ago. All large transactions require his direct approval." A flag. He had locked her out. It wasn't just about control. It was a leash, yanked from 2 states away. A cold fury, clean and sharp, rose in her. "There's one more thing, ma'am," the banker added, his tone changing slightly. "There's a note here from Mr. Vance's personal assistant. He asks that if you call, we are to connect you to him directly. He's very eager to speak with you. Should I put you through?" The world seemed to stop. She stood in the dusty Arizona sunlight, the phone receiver slick with sweat in her hand, and pictured him in his sprawling office, a glass wall overlooking the city of fake angels, waiting for this very moment. He hadn't sent search parties. He hadn't called the police. He had simply cut off her resources and waited. It was a power play, a summons. That's how life is. Just when you think you've escaped the spider's web, you feel a single silken thread pull tight around your ankle. The voice on the other end of the line was offering her a connection back to the cage, back to the comfort, the money, the ease. All she had to do was say yes. For a long moment, she was silent. The entire town of Harmony, her new fragile life, the stage, the kindness of strangers, it all hung in the balance of her answer. "No," she said, her voice clear and steady. "That won't be necessary." And she hung up the phone. The click of the receiver was a small, sharp sound, but to Veronica, it felt like a cannon shot, a declaration of independence. She had no money, she had no plan, but as she walked away from the payphone, leaving Arthur's ghost waiting on a silent line, she had never felt more powerful.
You know, there's a moment in every great American story, every story of reinvention, where you hit a wall. It's the moment the car breaks down for good, the money runs out, and the road ahead seems to disappear into an impossible fog. I've learned that this is not the end of the story. It's the moment the story truly begins. It's the point where you have to decide if you're going to turn back or find a whole new way to go forward. Hanging up on Arthur was a victory, but it was a victory that left Veronica standing broke in the middle of a town that was not her own. Her declaration of independence didn't fix the Mercedes fuel pump or pay next week's rent. The reality of her situation settled in, cold and heavy. She had run as far as her pride and a small amount of cash would take her. Her last performance as Mrs. Gibbs in our town was that weekend. standing on the bare stage, speaking Thornton Wilder's beautiful, simple words about life and death and the meaning of it all. She felt a profound connection to the role, to the story. It was her story now. The final curtain call, the thunderous applause from the small, packed auditorium was for her. Not for the movie star, but for V, the woman who had shown up and done the work. It was the purest praise she had ever received. After the show, Mr. Abernathy, his face beaming with pride, handed her a small envelope. Inside was $67. It was her share of the ticket sales. It was everything they had. The gesture, so small and so significant, brought tears to her eyes. The next morning, she knew what she had to do. Retreat was not an option. Going back to Arthur was unthinkable. The only path was forward, and forward, it seemed, meant going back to the one place she had any claim, the one place her name might still mean something. She had to go back to Los Angeles, not to the house in the hills, but to the city itself, to face the ghost of her past on her own terms. But the Mercedes, as if sensing her resolve, refused to cooperate. The engine sputtered, coughed, and died. It was the final ironic straw. Stranded. She was standing there, staring at the useless, beautiful car, when a familiar pickup truck pulled up alongside her. It was Hank, one of the truckers from Thanksgiving dinner. "Car trouble?" he asked, his voice a friendly low rumble. She explained the situation, the dead fuel pump, the lack of funds, the need to get to LA. She didn't explain the why. She didn't have to. Hank listened, stroking his beard and thought, "Well, that's a tough spot. Tell you what, I'm dead heading back to California. My rig's empty. It's a bit of a drive, but I'm leaving in an hour. The passenger seat's open if you want it." He paused. "And there's a fellow I know runs a garage in Kingman who owes me a favor. He could probably tow your car and hold on to it for you till you can sort things out." Veronica stared at him. Another stranger. Another moment of simple, unadorned kindness. In her old life, a problem like this would have been solved with a single, imperious phone call to an assistant. Here, it was solved by a man she barely knew, a man who saw another human being in a tough spot and offered a hand. That's life, isn't it? Just when you think you've reached the end of your own road, life sends a truck. It's not always the ride you were expecting, but sometimes it's the one that takes you exactly where you need to go. An hour later, Veronica was climbing into the high passenger seat of Hank's gleaming 18-wheeler. She took one last look at her beautiful broken-down convertible, a symbol of the freedom she had chased. Now she was surrendering control, putting her fate in the hands of another. As the big rig pulled onto the highway, its air horn blowing a deep, resonant goodbye to the small town of Harmony, she wasn't driving into the dawn anymore. She was riding into the belly of the beast. She was going home.
You know, they say you can never go home again. But what they don't tell you is that it's because you're not the same person and the home you left isn't the same place. You see it with new eyes. When Veronica had lived high in the hills, Los Angeles had been a glittering carpet spread at her feet, a map of her kingdom. But from the passenger seat of Hank's truck, descending into the basin, it was something else entirely. It was a smog-choked, sprawling, beautiful, and terrible beast, and she was no longer its queen. She was just another soul entering its gates. The sheer scale of the city, which had once felt like a promise, now felt like a challenge. The freeways were rivers of angry metal, and from her high perch in the truck's cab, Veronica watched the drivers in their cars, their faces set with a grim, lonely determination. These were the people who served the drinks, parked the cars, and chased the dreams that the Hollywood elite took for granted. For the first time, she felt a kinship with them, not with the people in the glass houses on the hills. Hank navigated the complex interchanges with a practiced ease. "Where to, V?" he asked as they approached the city center.
She didn't want to go anywhere near Beverly Hills. She needed a place that was anonymous, a base camp for the battle ahead. "The bus station downtown is fine," she said. "Union Station." He dropped her off in the bustling, chaotic arrivals lane. The air was thick with exhaust fumes and the sound of a dozen languages. It was the heart of the real Los Angeles. As she retrieved her single suitcase, Hank pressed a couple of folded $20 bills into her hand. "For a hot meal and a bus pass," he said gruffly, avoiding his eyes. A few months ago, she would have been insulted. Now she just squeezed his calloused hand. "Thank you, Hank," she said, her voice full of a gratitude that went far beyond the money. "For everything." He just nodded. "You take care of yourself." And with a blast of his air horn, the big rig pulled back into the river of traffic and was gone. Veronica stood there for a moment, a solitary figure with a single suitcase on the edge of the city that had made her and broken her. She wasn't afraid. The fear had been burned out of her in the desert. In its place was a cold, quiet clarity. She didn't go into the station. She walked a few blocks, found a clean, no-name motel, the kind used by traveling salespeople and families on a tight budget, and paid for 3 nights in cash. The room was identical to the one in Arizona, but the view from the window was different. It wasn't a dusty street. It was a concrete jungle, with the distant, iconic silhouette of the downtown skyscrapers piercing the hazy sky. That's how life is. To truly reclaim your life, you can't just run away from the place that hurt you. Sooner or later, you have to go back and stand in the middle of it. You have to look the monster right in the eye and show it that you're no longer scared of its shadows. You have to prove, not to the world, but to yourself, that you are the one who gets to decide how the story ends.
You know, some stories have a scene so painful, you spend the rest of your life trying to forget it. You play it over and over in your mind until the memory cuts grooves into your soul. But I've learned something important. You can't erase a scene. But if you're brave enough, you can go back to the same set, stand on the same spot, and write a new one, a better one, a final one. The taxi ride up into the hills was like a journey into a foreign country. The manicured lawns, the towering gates, the houses that looked more like museums. It all felt alien to her now. When the taxi pulled up to the familiar, imposing gate of her former home, she felt no nostalgia, no sadness. She only felt like a director arriving on set, ready for the day's work. She paid the driver and walked up the long driveway. She still had her old key, a small, simple piece of metal that felt like a relic from another civilization. She let herself in. The house was just as she'd left it, vast, silent, and smelling of expensive, sterile perfection. It was no longer her home. It was a state.
You know, some stories have a scene so painful, you spend the rest of your life trying to forget it. You play it over and over in your mind until the memory cuts grooves into your soul. But I've learned something important. You can't erase a scene, but if you're brave enough, you can go back to the same set, stand on the same spot, and write a new one, a better one, a final one. The taxi ride up into the hills was like a journey into a foreign country. The manicured lawns, the towering gates, the houses that looked more like museums, it all felt alien to her now. When the taxi pulled up to the familiar, imposing gate of her former home, she felt no nostalgia, no sadness. She only felt like a director arriving on set, ready for the day's work. She paid the driver and walked up the long driveway. She still had her old key, a small, simple piece of metal that felt like a relic from another civilization. She let herself in. The house was just as she'd left it, vast, silent, and smelling of expensive, sterile perfection. It was no longer her home. It was a stage. And she knew exactly where the final act was set to take place. She walked down the spiral staircase, her sensible new shoes making no sound on the plush carpeting. As she approached the cinema room, she heard his voice. He wasn't whispering her old lines this time. He was holding court. "And the beauty of the concept," Arthur was saying, his voice booming with the confidence of a man closing a deal, "is that it's a classic story, but we give it a modern, edgier twist. The audience gets the comfort of the familiar, but the thrill of the new." She pushed the door open. Arthur was there, sitting in that same velvet armchair, but he wasn't alone. Two younger men in sharp suits, obviously studio executives, were hanging on his every word. He looked up, annoyed at the interruption, and his face froze. The blood drained from it. The master producer, the man who was never caught off guard, was utterly, completely stunned. Veronica walked calmly into the room. She looked at the two young men, who were staring at her, confused. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice even and cool, "I believe your meeting is over." They looked from her to Arthur's shell-shocked face, and, sensing a drama far more compelling than any script they'd discussed that day, quickly gathered their things and left the room. Now they were alone, in the room where her world had ended. "Veronica," he stammered, finding his voice, "what is this? Where have you been?" She didn't answer his questions. She walked over to the small table beside his chair and placed a thick manila envelope on it. "I believe this is the final scene of our little production, Arthur," she said. Her voice was not angry. It was not sad. It was the calm, clear voice of a director giving a final, non-negotiable note. He looked at the envelope. "What is it?" "It's a script. Our final one. It's a copy of the divorce papers my lawyer filed this morning. This isn't a negotiation, Arthur. It's a notification." She turned her back on him then and walked over to the complex control panel for the production system. Her fingers, which had once trembled, were now steady. She pressed a series of buttons. The lights in the room dimmed, the projector whirred to life, the huge screen flickered to life. The projector whirred. But there was no movie. There was no ghost of her younger self. There was only a brilliant, clean, empty rectangle of white light. It flooded the room, banishing all the shadows. It illuminated Arthur's stunned face, making him look small and powerless in his velvet throne. "I'm rewriting the ending," she said softly, more to herself than to him. That's how life is. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is erase the old film and replace it with a blank screen. It's a promise, a declaration that the story from this moment forward is yours and yours alone to write. She turned and walked out of the room, leaving him there, alone, bathed in the bright, empty light of a future he would have no part in. She didn't slam the door. She didn't need to. The performance, at last, was truly over.
You know, for most of my life, I believed that power was something loud. It was a booming voice, a big house, a famous name. But I've learned that's not true power. True power is quiet. It's the silent, unshakable knowledge of your own worth. It's the ability to sit across a table from the person who tried to break you and realize that they no longer have any hold on you at all. The meeting took place a week later in the sterile, glass-walled conference room of a divorce lawyer's office in Century City. The air was thick with unspoken words. Arthur was there, flanked by two aggressive-looking attorneys in $1,000 suits. He looked diminished, his usual charismatic bluster replaced by a sullen, simmering anger. He had expected her to come back broken, begging. He had not expected this calm, resolute stranger. Veronica sat alone. Her lawyer, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Miss Chen, had advised her to bring a friend for support, but Veronica, for most of my life, I believed that power was something loud. It was a booming voice, a big house, a famous name. But I've learned that's not true power. True power is quiet. It's the silent, unshakable knowledge of your own worth. It's the ability to sit across a table from the person who tried to break you and realize that they no longer have any hold on you at all. The meeting took place a week later in the sterile, glass-walled conference room of a divorce lawyer's office in Century City. The air was thick with unspoken words. Arthur was there, flanked by two aggressive-looking attorneys in $1,000 suits. He looked diminished. His usual charismatic bluster was replaced by a sullen, simmering anger. He had expected her to come back broken, begging. He had not expected this calm, resolute stranger. Veronica sat alone. Her lawyer, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Ms. Chen, had advised her to bring a friend for support. But Veronica had politely refused. This was a scene she had to play by herself. She wore a simple, elegant dress she'd bought at a secondhand store. A far cry from her old designer wardrobe, but it felt more like her than any of those costumes ever had. Arthur's lawyers started first. They talked about his generosity, his reputation. They made a lowball offer, a settlement that was more like severance pay, designed to make her go away quietly. It was the classic Hollywood playbook. Control the narrative, silence the inconvenient woman. When they finished, Veronica didn't get angry. She didn't raise her voice. She simply looked across the table, directly into Arthur's eyes, and for the first time in their entire relationship, he was the one who looked away. Then she spoke. "I'm not interested in your generosity, Arthur," she said, her voice so quiet that everyone in the room had to lean in to hear. "I'm not here for your money. I'm here for what's mine." She pushed a document across the table. It wasn't from her lawyer. It was something she'd had drawn up herself. "That," she explained, "is an injunction. It legally prohibits you, your production company, or any of your associates from using my likeness, my image, or any footage from my films for any purpose whatsoever, without my express written consent and financial participation." Arthur stared at the document, his face turning a dark shade of red. "That's preposterous," he spat. "Those films are part of my library." "No, Arthur," she corrected him gently. "They are part of my history. And you don't get to use my history as the source material for your future projects anymore. You don't get to use my youth as a prop to sell your cheap remix." She paused, letting the words sink in. "The ghost you're so fond of is officially off the market." It was a masterstroke. She wasn't attacking his wealth. She was attacking his currency, his ability to mine her past for his profit. "And as for the settlement," she continued, turning to the lawyers, "California is a community property state. I'm entitled to 50% of everything that was built during our marriage. The house, the stocks,
the art collection, and the production company. One of Arthur's lawyers started to bluster, but Veronica held up a hand. She said, "I don't want to run it," she said, a faint, wry smile touching her lips. "I just want my half of its value. So you can either write me a very large check, or we can let a judge dissolve the company and liquidate its assets. Your choice." That's how life is. The moment you stop fighting on their battlefield and force them to fight on yours, the war is already won. She hadn't come to beg for scraps from his table. She had come to calmly, quietly, saw the table in half. In the stunned silence that followed, Veronica stood up. She had said everything she needed to say. She had owned her past, defined her present, and secured her future. The spotlight in the room was no longer his. It was hers. And it wasn't the flickering, temporary light of a movie projector. It was the steady, unwavering glow of her own self-worth.
You know, we're all raised on this idea of the American dream. The big house, the fast car, the name in lights. It's a beautiful, shiny promise. But I've learned that for a lot of us, that dream is a borrowed one. It's a script someone else wrote for us. The real American dream, the one that lasts, is the one you write for yourself. It's often smaller and quieter, but it's built on a foundation of your own truth. The settlement was, as Veronica had known it would be, massive. Arthur, faced with the public humiliation of having his company dismantled, had chosen to write the check. Overnight, Veronica went from being penniless to being a woman of independent and substantial means. But the money felt different this time. It wasn't a stipend or an allowance. It was earned. It was the back pay for 30 years of a performance she had finally quit. Her lawyer, Miss Chen, assumed she would buy a condo in Beverly Hills or a beach house in Malibu. But Veronica surprised her. She didn't want the gilded cage 2.0. She wanted something real. A few weeks later, she was back on the road. But this time, she was driving a brand new, reliable pickup truck. Her old Mercedes was still waiting for her in that garage in Kingman, and she'd get to it eventually. But for now, she needed something that could haul things, because she was building. She drove back to Harmony, Arizona, back to the small town that had offered her refuge when she had nothing. She didn't arrive with fanfare. She just came back. She bought a small, charming, but run-down house on the edge of town, the kind with a wraparound porch and a big, neglected garden. And then she bought the town's old, defunct movie theater, the Majestic. It was a beautiful Art Deco building that had been shuttered for 20 years, its marquee dark, its seats gathering dust. Her new life began not with a party, but with a hammer. She started working on the house, learning how to sand floors and paint walls. She hired the local handyman she had first seen on her community notice board to help her. And she poured her heart and her resources into bringing the Majestic back to life. She didn't want to show Hollywood blockbusters. She wanted to create a space for the community, a place for the Harmony community players to have a real home, a place to show the classic films that had inspired her as a girl, a place to host local film festivals for aspiring storytellers who didn't have a voice in the big city. Mr. Abernathy, the English teacher, became her partner in the venture. Marge, from the diner, consulted on the perfect popcorn. Even Hank and Sal, the truckers, would stop by whenever their routes took them through Arizona, offering to help with heavy lifting or just to share a cup of coffee. One crisp autumn evening, a year after she had first stumbled into town, was the grand reopening of the Majestic. The new neon sign glowed against the twilight sky. The whole town was there. It wasn't a red carpet premiere. It was a town potluck. People brought casseroles and pies. It was real. Veronica stood in the back of the newly restored theater, watching the faces of her friends and neighbors as they looked up at the screen.
The first film she chose to show was not one of her own. It was It's a Wonderful Life, a story about a man who gets to see the profound impact of his simple, ordinary existence. That's how life is. Sometimes you have to lose a life you thought you wanted to find the life that was waiting for you all along. Looking at the joyful faces in the crowd, Veronica knew she had found her new American dream. It wasn't about being seen by millions. It was about creating a place where a few people could feel seen. It wasn't about a house on a hill overlooking a city of angels. It was about a small house on a quiet street in a town full of decent, ordinary people who had become her family.
You know, when you're young, a sunset can feel a little sad. It's the end of a day, the closing of a chapter. But if you're lucky enough to see a great many of them, you start to understand a sunset isn't an ending. It's a promise of a period of rest, of quiet, and the guarantee that after the darkness, the light will return. It's a moment of grace. Veronica sits on the porch of her small, beautifully restored house in Harmony. The porch swing, which she and Hank installed on one of his visits, moves in a slow, comforting rhythm. In her hand, she holds a heavy ceramic mug, just like the ones at Marge's diner, filled with warm tea. The sky to the west is on fire, a breathtaking explosion of orange, pink, and deep violet painted across the vast canvas of the desert. From down the street, she can hear the sounds of the high school marching band practicing for the Friday night baseball game. The Majestic's marquee, which she can just see over the rooftops, glows with the title of this week's film, Sunset Lovers. It's playing as part of a classic film series curated by Mr. Abernathy. She smiles to herself. Seeing her own face on that screen, the ghost of that hopeful, fiery young woman no longer brings a sting of pain or betrayal. Now, she just feels a gentle, compassionate affection for that girl. She is no longer haunted by her. She has, in a way, adopted her. She has finally given that young woman the ending she deserved. A pickup truck, the same kind she drives, pulls into her driveway. A man gets out. He's about her age, a local rancher with kind eyes and hands weathered by honest work. He's the handyman who helped her fix this house and who, over months of shared lunches and quiet conversations, has become a gentle, steady presence in her life. He doesn't say much. He just comes over, sits on the porch step, and watches the sunset with her. There is no drama, no passion in the Hollywood sense. There is just a quiet, comfortable companionship, a peace she never knew was possible. Her old life in the hills feels like a story she read in a book a long, long time ago, about a woman she vaguely knew. The betrayals that once felt like the end of the world are now just scars, and scars, as I've learned, are not signs of weakness. They are proof that you were stronger than whatever tried to hurt you. The last sliver of the sun disappears behind the distant mountains, and the first stars begin to prick the deep indigo of the sky. That's how life is. It will break your heart, yes. It will knock you to your knees. But if you can find the courage to stand back up, to walk away from the life that is hurting you, and to be open to the small, quiet kindnesses of the world, you'll find that your own story is so much richer and more beautiful than the one you thought you had lost. You learn that freedom isn't a destination you drive toward. It's the road itself. And happiness isn't a grand cinematic moment under a spotlight. It's a quiet evening, on a porch swing, watching the sun go down, knowing you are finally, truly home.